ברוכים לשר המודיעין והתחבורה הישראלי.
Good afternoon to Minister of Intelligence and Transportation, Katz. So are you celebrating in Jerusalem? Which we're not just celebrating, there's some very crucial decisions being made, and we understand the full weight of the responsibility. We have the matter of the nuclear program, and last night was a very tense night, and we're really in an atmosphere of celebration, but something's not quite clear. I have one request, if I may. I was invited here and I prepared a talk, and now I'm told that it's an interview. Let me read just a few lines of my talk, if I may. Ladies and gentlemen, and the Prime Minister's next visit to the United States is critical, especially on the background of the Korean crisis. He has to ask President Trump to withdraw from the Iranian agreement. You cannot make compromises with dictatorships that seek nuclear power, and ultimately, if you do, it leads to changing the rules of the game. The crisis in North Korea and the reality that has developed, and from the point of view of the United States and its allies and the terrible dilemmas that have around, all this shows that there's no way except to withdraw from, freeze, or stop the Iranian agreement. Otherwise, it will definitely lead to a nuclearized Iran in the future. I will not continue with my talk, and I see that this was the speech I gave last year. It's still completely up to date. The same formula is true now too, and the Prime Minister at that meeting with President Trump, which I considered very important, crucial, he indeed raised that matter, and he did so again in the UN, and I think that started the process of consolidating a joint policy with the United States, which reached its culmination with a decision yesterday to cancel the Iranian agreement, and here we are. So you say you were the first, not Netanyahu. You were the first. I was the first to say, no. I said it at the Herzliya conference last year in the context of an approach that was somewhat different from that of the defense community. I'm the Minister of Intelligence, and I know what's happening. They said there is an agreement with Iran. Let's make the most of it. And we'll focus now on other things. I thought that to come to the President of the United States at that time, at that meeting, and to say that we're going to see Shiite militias in Syria, and we will consider that a threat that the President wouldn't understand. But when you see what's happened with Syria, and you see those agreements, that is an agreement that is understood. And we share the strategic approach, and we'll see it all trickling down and everything connecting on the way. But why do we know now what will prevent from the Iranians saying, okay, the deal is off the table, and we will join forces with European countries, with Russia, with the Chinese, with everyone who's on their side, and perhaps not reach new understanding? What would motivate them to come to the negotiating table? There was some form of supervision in that agreement. How do we preserve that? That agreement was what would lead them to a nuclear bomb. Even if they kept it, the Prime Minister showed all that information quite rightly, and it was a good thing he did. And if the Iranians wanted to be part of the agreement, they wouldn't have signed that agreement in 2015 with Obama. Twice they backed out. In 2003, they thought that George W. Bush was going to invade Iran after he invaded Iraq. And in 2015, they signed in the wake of sanctions. It's true that the West signed a bad agreement. But the West is not united now. So this agreement is good for the Iranians. It keeps the supervision away from them. And the assumption it was bring them over to the side of the good guys, beyond the words of the agreement itself. And they took advantage to do exactly the opposite. I talk with intelligence entities throughout the world, and I've been asking them, what do you think is driving the Iranians? Is it a fear of invasion? No. They all answer what they are all motivated by is ideology to export the Shiite ideology all over the world. They are willing to, those European countries are willing to take Iranian money. They have a declared ambition to destroy Israel. They do, not only Israel, other places too. And by withdrawing from the agreement, perhaps the IDF thought that the agreement was working and it was important to focus on the first threat, the first front. The assumption we all arrived at, together with the President of the United States, was that this agreement was no good and it would not prevent Iran from reaching nuclear weapons. No one foresaw the foothold that Iran would gain in Syria. There was the matter of ISIS, which has territorially at least been defeated in Syria, and we helped out with all kinds of intelligence and so on. And when we said, now look at what Iran is doing, we didn't see anybody at our side. And the previous the entire attack of radical Islam, it's not all of Islam, but radical Islam, which is seen in Al-Qaeda and ISIS and other forms of terror, it started with the campaign of George W. Bush in Iraq. And now to halt the Shiite terror in Europe, with all due respect, it cannot overcome the economic power of the United States. And when Europe or Japan is going to start investing new money when there are sanctions from the United States, Iran has two options now: to fall in line or to collapse and give up. So if it does not fall in line with true effective supervision, which is unwilling to accept, and to stop the development of ballistic missiles, and to stop supporting the terror organizations and sending out terror to different places, there's a huge gap between public opinion in Iran, the desire and expectation of a very highly developed nation that wants to advance economically, and the actual situation. And if they follow the second path of confrontation, it could lead to yet another result, which is not at the right now marked down, and that is the collapse of the regime. That's what solve all the problems, because the problem isn't with the Iranian people. If this regime of the Ayatollahs collapses, then Iran will be our best ally in the region, as it was once in the past. You and Mr. Trump and Mr. Netanyahu are talk directly to the public in Iran. So is the idea here to build up public opinion and lead to the collapse? I don't think enough attention has been paid to this until now. I'm not usually in favor of regime change. That's not usually things that we deal with. But it's there. I'm talking about the economy. The economic war. Russia can't help Iran with that. The rich Arab countries are against Iran. There is a Western coalition led by the US and with Arabs, with the Sunni Arabs, and Israel is there. And if the Iranians refuse to give in or fall in line, they'll ultimately have to give in to this economic power with the definition of the threat. If you enrich uranium, that is what President Trump will tell them, we'll do what we plan to do to North Korea, which is much more determined and cruel than you are, and that would lead to the military level. You don't need boots on the ground in Iran, because we're talking about a regime, we're talking about a public. Nobody's going to invade Iran and conquer Iran. The Iranian leadership, I heard what Khamenei's strategy is. They're waiting for Trump to die. That's a very interesting strategy. But I think ultimately there has to be a thinking process with all that radicalism. Do we insist on remaining in Syria? That has a price. If we insist not being part of a new scheme, and the Europeans, for the most part, also understand that they need effective supervision and to prevent the development of the nuclear weapons. The facts are quite clear, and I think what President Trump did, he said, I'm withdrawing, I'm preparing the sanctions, and you have time to... And his strategy, like with North Korea, is not to reach the stage of violence, but by using his power to prevent reaching that stage. Trump has indeed given 3 months, and we know that we have allies, Germany, France, UK, who... the allies, in what way are they allies? You tell me, aren't they our allies? There is cooperation, intelligence, usually in their favor and so on. In the UN, we don't see them supporting us. Even we talk about the restriction of missiles, they talk about 2,000 kilometers. Which country happens to be inside that 2,000 kilometer range? I don't see. Of course, Europe is not a strategic ally of Israel against Iran. Europe doesn't care if Iran moves ahead with those things that should have been stopped at a much earlier stage in every way. And we don't expect the US to fight instead of us. We set a very challenging red line in Syria, and we are fulfilling it based on our own reports and foreign reports. It's not an easy thing. We're setting the lines very clearly in order to prevent a war. By demonstrating our power, we want them to understand that they don't need to be there, that they don't need to create the capabilities against Israel. That's the goal. Not to have no Iranians there, but that campaign that they tried to build starting last August, an entire model, after ISIS was removed, and to deploy against Israel, we don't want that for us and for the coming generations. When you discuss the attacks, when we look a little bit what's happening in the past few weeks, there's a feeling that what in the past was clear and that Israel denied and would not take explicit responsibility, it seems to it changed. Isn't that pushing the Iranians into a corner where they'll have to respond? Are we, first of all, we still have that denial expanse. Israel didn't take responsibility. If Nasrallah said, you've harmed our soldiers, we won't allow it. I don't accept that formula. The Iranians are sitting there in Syria. We're not looking for anything in Iran. And if we prevent that, then they think they have to harm us. We will act based on intelligence to prevent, and we will respond, and of course deploy for active and other defense, even if they didn't fire anything at us. As long as it is limited to Syria, Israel's advantage is huge. If it moves into Lebanon, we still have a big advantage, but the prices are different. We're not, if Israel facing off with Iran over a territorial but there's the matter of the nuclear intelligence from Iran. We've made clear to the Iranians we know what their response is. Isn't there a danger, as a minister, in exposing this information? Isn't there any danger to our intelligent infrastructures in these patients? Aren't we putting them at risk? I don't know if I'm going to calm you down. You're a journalist, and there are other journalists here. You can be sure that you don't know 99% of the secrets of the state of Israel. I say that as someone who knows them all, as the Minister of Intelligence together with the Prime Minister, and we weekly meetings with the head of the Mossad and so on. And there's also the Minister of Defense is aware of these things, and the knowledge that accumulates at various levels. And there is constant, amazing activity. Some of the people here remember that from the time. I'd like to say something about those who are no longer in the system. Within a very short time, they're not up to date. If it's not something that started in their time. I heard all these formers saying this and that. They have no idea what's going on. And so there is a very serious system here, and we're not revealing any secrets unnecessarily. And, you know, these possibilities were presented. It was quite, I mean, they got the green light to go ahead. It was clear in advance that this was something that was of security and political importance, to take this huge cache of documents from Iran and bring them here. Would anyone think that when the Prime Minister does something and all the intelligence agencies were updated, I think it was right for him to intensify it to a level. So, you know, the attempt to drive a wedge between the Mossad and the Prime Minister is completely a political maneuver.
I have a question. A month ago, the details of the strike against the reactor in Syria were published. It took more than 10 years to publish this information, and here we see information that from one day to the next is being published. So what about the policy has changed? Well, these things are like night and day. There, we were concerned by a Syrian reaction, and here you're not concerned with an Iranian reaction? The Iranians are here either way. They said that they were promoting their ability to fire against Israel. And by the way, the defense system very rarely did brief the media, did instruct the villages in these towns in the Golan Heights to open their war shelters. There are many components involved. This is Iran we're talking about. This country has many capabilities, and I think that the government is steering very cautiously, headed by the Prime Minister, and the cabinet is steering this boat very wisely. And
no daylight.
And the discussions are joined, and this activity is very much challenging. And I would think that in such on such serious matters, you should also have a united front, and it's not like the opposition would say one thing one day and then the next day they'd be embarrassed. And we used to have leaders like Begin and Rabin that even when the opposition would support and back up actions such as Entebbe, which Rabin headed, and so Begin supported, and you know, these things are at the heart of our security, and we need to be united on these fronts. Well, Israel, at least according to foreign reports, last night gave a preemptive attack to the Iranian issue, and we know that if we had thwarted this attempt, where are the Iranians headed now? What are we looking towards? Is the response only from Syria? Are we looking elsewhere? Without taking responsibility for this specific event, it's much of the same. I mean, in principle and in practice, it's the same thing. The state of Israel must identify by its own means such trends. And we must understand that the Iranian array has yet to be deployed in Syria, and that's why this is so important. What does it mean to hit? To hit, whether it's missiles that are about to be launched, then you strike against them. If it is part of the preparation for absorbing or for taking the militia, then it will also act. But in the time it takes to fly from Iran to Syria, I'm not even sure how long it takes, and you fill aircraft with missiles and you bring them over. So what we need to do is to actually thwart the Iranian desire to go into Syria, because we're not going to conquer Syria, they're not going to occupy it. That's not something that we're trying or wanting to do. But if there's a number of missiles that can shift here and there, that's why what happened yesterday is so important on the high levels and also on the practical level, to bring to Iranian awareness a clear conclusion that they have nothing to seek in Syria, that the price they'll pay is too high. And the talks that the Prime Minister is having with Moscow today is also very important. We're not hurting the Russians, and it's not an obvious thing to do to talk with us right now when they're on the Syrian soil. But if they have an interest in the Middle East, whether it's airports, whether it's Shiite militias, and when you try to transfer Shiites into Damascus instead of Sunnis, that's the kind of thing that allow us to have some space for maneuvering, and therefore we are working on the kinetic operational side and also on the political side. These two things go hand in hand and both lead to the same outcome. You know, we talked only about intelligence and not about transport, but just for the record, I want to say that I talked about traffic and what's going to happen with traffic. That's what you have to do. That's all you have to say after 9 years. Talk about transport. Go ahead. But do you accept criticism that you are heard more in the capacity of the Minister of Intelligence and not as transport? Well, you chose what to ask about as an interviewer. I was asked to the cabinet as a Minister of Intelligence, but I only engage in intelligence 20% of the time. 80% of the time I am in transport. I am connecting the Galilee and the Negev. I am bringing mass systems, transportation systems to Israel. We connect the Jerusalem and the Negev and the north by train. We have a revolution like 70 years ago in Europe and 150 years ago in the United States, and I think that history will judge me positively, and it'll be a chapter in the history of Israel, because I'm rendering Israel a more modern state and more egalitarian state where you can live everywhere. So I hope I'll enjoy the fruit of my labor, but in all polls, on all opinion polls, I am number one in the government, because people understand that these failures in transportation are because of things that have not been taken care of for years, and we're changing reality. Thank you very much, Minister Katz. Thank you.
I hope you never becomes Prime Minister. It's impossible.
אחר צהריים טובים, תודה.
Good afternoon. I would like to thank